Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Monica Ortiz Uribe. On Tuesday, New Mexico kicked off its 60-day legislative session at the state capitol in Santa Fe. On that same day, Governor Susana Martinez delivered her State of the State address. And one of her talking points that received the most applause was her call to repeal a 2003 law that allows illegal immigrants to get a driver's license. Now, that topic is no stranger to the legislature. They've argued that point for the last 2 years, and the law still remains unchanged. So the debate continues. And that's our subject for today's show. Should illegal immigrants in the state of New Mexico continue to be allowed to get a driver's license? On that note, I'll introduce my two guests for today. We have Sarah Nolan. She's the director of a nonprofit called New Mexico Communities in Action and Faith, also known as CAFE. And sitting right next to her is Captain Mannion Long, and with the Doña Ana Sheriff's Department. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
So, Captain Long, let's start with you. How is it that such a small piece of rectangular plastic could cause such passionate debate in a single state? What makes a driver's license so valuable?
People use a driver's license to prove that they've met the requirements to operate a vehicle, but it's more than that. It's also a form of identification. By having that state-issued identification, it can lend a sense of legitimacy to somebody's identity or who they claim to be. Initially, driver's licenses were just that, a license to drive. But we use those to cash checks, to open up accounts. So they're a very important part of what we carry with us.
Okay, and so what does New Mexico require? What are the requirements? Well, if I go to the MVD today and I want to get a driver's license, what kinds of documentation are they going to ask me for? It's
actually fairly simple. You need to provide some form of identification, whether it's a birth certificate. They have different forms of identification that they'll accept to prove who you are. They can be identification cards from other countries. And then you need to provide some sort of document that proves that you're residing in the state, and that can be in the form of utility bills. And once those requirements are met, a written test and a road test is usually in order, and successful completion of that, and a person can have a license to operate a motor vehicle.
So if I live in, say I'm a student from Mexico and I'm studying here at the university and I'm going to be here for 4 years and I want to be able to drive, I can show up at the DMV with my Mexican passport and my bills from my apartment complex, and that'll be enough.
Correct. That would probably, in conjunction with, if you're a student at Mexico State University, you're probably going to have an NMSU ID card. Probably that and your passport or your consular card from Mexico, along with some utility bills, would meet the requirements the state of New Mexico sets forward to be eligible to take the exams.
And I understand New Mexico differs from other states, and that other states require, in addition to similar documents, proof of legal status in the country, whether it be a Social Security number or a resident card. Is that the
correct? As you mentioned, 2003, the governor at the time, legislation was passed that allowed people's status not to be a factor in whether or not they received a license to operate a motor vehicle.
Okay, all right. So Sarah, you work with the undocumented community quite a bit through your nonprofit. So can you tell us what people you work with on a day-to-day basis, what do they use a driver's license for? How is it valuable in their day-to-day life?
And they use it just like any of us do. So they use it to go to school, go to work, take their kids to school, to the doctor, any number of things. And we have a number of students especially that use their ID card to get to school. Daniel, we have two siblings, Daniel and Yanin, that just qualified for deferred action, and they got their work permits in. But now that they have a card that says they can work in this country and a card that identifies who they are, is just such a valuable piece of plastic. Like you said, it's so much more than that. Daniel is a student at NMSU, and he's 21, and he has an 8-year-old sister and parents that live out in Radium, and they rely on their oldest to help run the family. Yanin is a 17-year-old that wants to be a nurse, and she's in one of the best performing charter schools in Las Cruces. And these kids have bright futures, and we don't see why there needs to be a barrier put up stifling their potential.
Now, our partners with the news organization New Mexico in Focus interviewed the governor on the subject and asked her, well, if the license is repealed, then what is this community that's undocumented? How are they supposed to get around after that? And her answer was, you know, they got around before, and there's other ways to get around New Mexico. I mean, what would Danielle and the other girl you mentioned, how would they, is there a way, other means for them to get around other than their own cars? I mean, a bus, public transportation?
From Radium? That would make it really difficult.
Well, tell us where, for those of us who don't know where Radium is.
So Radium is north of Las Cruces, and I mean, anyone who has tried to take the bus in Las Cruces knows to schedule your appointments 2 days in advance. Like, it just, it's not a sustainable mode of transportation, especially if you are trying to get to work and get your family to school. And the language that the governor used when she said, well, they'll make do, for us, we don't think that that's enough. The governor also doesn't see it justified if our families aren't making do with health care. She just expanded Medicaid. She doesn't see that it's proper that that New Mexicans make do without a job. She's creating a jobs plan. So why allow for this piece, this issue, for families and children to make do when everything else just isn't enough for her? So that she wants everybody to be better and be able to provide for their families and have well-being across New Mexico, and yet for this one issue, she's okay with letting us make do.
Well, so the argument in favor of repealing the driver's license law is mostly attributed to public safety, so Captain Long, I'm going to ask you about let's talk about public safety concerns when it comes to driver's licenses and the undocumented community. How do driver's licenses help law enforcement?
First and foremost, they provide us with what should be a legitimate means of identification of that person. We use them to establish a person's date of birth, and those are things that are required in order for somebody to get that. So we rely on those as a tool of identification. It also has an address that person will list on their driver's license. We can even do a driver's license history and see if that person has a driving record of citations. Those citations could tell us the type of vehicle that person is driving, the location that the traffic stop was made. So they really are an invaluable tool to assist us in doing our job and identifying people.
Now, on the other side of things, can a driver's license, having a driver's license, help facilitate someone who wants to commit a crime? Which is the other argument made, right? That some people are coming in out of state that don't live in New Mexico to fraudulently obtain a driver's license in New Mexico, and some in law enforcement have said, well, we don't know, they're untraceable. They've used a fake address, they've used a fake name. We don't know how to get a hold of them or what they're going to use that driver's license for. Are there things that are potentially harmful that a driver's license can be used for?
Well, I think that's it, is that currently people attempting to obtain New Mexico driver's license fraudulently. Of course, that's been in the media. There have been those instances that that's happened. When somebody obtains a driver's license, and in most of these issues they've been undocumented persons, even from other states, and it gets back to that driver's license lending legitimacy to somebody, that their identity. So that's kind of why it's important. But when we have those issues, it can water down the validity statewide of those people that have driver's licenses that are legitimate. It brings into question how valid all of our driver's licenses are as a form of identification.
I see, I see. So I think you had mentioned that that the sheriff is concerned about the real ID requirements. Can you talk about that briefly?
The Federal Real ID Act requires that the states have a form of identification that is backed up by certain requirements, and each state is to be held to that standard. Currently, we've been allowed a deferment, temporary deferment, to meet the provisions of the Real ID Act, because we still give driver's license to people that are undocumented. Part of the National Real ID Act requires that people be of a legal status, whether they're residents or on a visa, a student visa, or citizens. New Mexico can't do that right now. It brings into question the ability of residents of New Mexico that are of a legal status to use their state-issued driver's license or identification card to travel nationwide and use that New Mexico
in other words,
ID.
If and once this act goes into effect, people that legitimately have a legitimately acquired driver's license from New Mexico might have trouble boarding a plane, for example.
That's correct.
Yeah, and we saw some of this in the news as well, right? That some in New Mexico were wondering whether or not they had to get a passport, even just to travel within the United States. Now, is that a concern that New Mexicans should have in the near future?
I think it's a concern. The sheriff believes that it's a concern. And ultimately, it's the responsibility of our state legislatures to address that one way or the other.
Right, so I think the confusion is in that the Real ID enactment has been delayed multiple times now, that how far in the future can we expect it to be enforced?
It's temporary, and that's the best answer that anybody's been able to give, is that the deferment's temporary. I do know that there are movements out there to repeal the Real ID Act in some form. I think it's going to be incumbent upon our elected officials at the state and national levels to solve these issues one way or the other.
Okay, okay. And Sarah, for you, the argument of fraud. I mean, there are definitely cases that are currently in different parts of the judicial system that involve some sort of fraud related to driver's licenses. What is your opinion in terms of in terms of the issue of fraud?
Right. So fraud happens. It happens in New Mexico. It happens across the country. For those that want to do bad things in our country, and for those that want to drink underage, like, fraud happens. I think what we should be talking about, though, is addressing the 11 million aspiring citizens that are already in this country through federal immigration reform. I think that's the biggest issue that our Congress and our administration has failed to address. And then it puts pressure on states like ours to have to defend things like driver's licenses, have to defend things like the Real ID Act, when there's one issue that could solve all of these smaller issues. And so we agree fraud is happening, and it shouldn't have to. There's a bigger solution to all of this, and we don't have to distract ourselves or distract our legislative body with these smaller issues when we could be tackling much bigger issues throughout our state and our country, like immigration reform.
Well, Captain Long, does the presence of fraud in a community bring about larger concerns for law enforcement or for the public safety in general? Take the case in Portales and Clovis, right, where there's at least 54 out-of-state immigrants that allegedly came in to fraudulently obtain a driver's license, and now the DA is in Clovis is saying, well, we don't know who those people are again or what they want the driver's license for. Do these fraud cases create a greater concern for New Mexico?
I think anytime that we have any type of fraud, it's a concern. We should be sensitive to the fact that when we have lenient laws and requirements, that it creates an atmosphere that is open for fraudulent use. We must remember that a driver's license and driving is a privilege granted to the residents of a state. It's not an entitlement or a right. And if we break this issue down to what it is it to drive, have the privilege of driving, or is it to have a form of identification? And maybe it's both. But until these issues are resolved, there's going to be fraud by people that have bad intentions. And that's just the way it's going to be.
All right, all right. And so, Sarah, when recently, or this month, the legislature in Illinois passed a bill that is similar to the law in New Mexico that allows illegal immigrants to drive with a driver's license, and the governor has said that he will sign it into law. Can you talk about what that means for people working, doing the kind of work you do in your nonprofit?
Yeah.
In California, that's also considering a similar bill as well.
Right. So the 2012 elections really demonstrated to us that there's a huge cultural shift and demographic shift happening in this country, and I think that that's what is spurring the conversation about immigration reform over the next few months. I think that we're going to see big cultural waves kind of clashing up against each other, with Illinois, California, and other states going one way, Arizona, and in some ways New Mexico wanting to go in another direction. So for us as New Mexicans, we have a decision to make. Do we want to continue to be the leaders in multiculturalism as a state? We're one of 5 majority-minority states in this country, where we've been able to teach other states how to live in multicultural communities because we've been doing it for so long. So we can either continue to be leaders in that way, or we can take a back seat and let other people lead. But I think our time as New Mexicans is now, and we're poised to demonstrate to the rest of this country how we treat aspiring citizens.
And Captain Long, what would happen? Let's say that the law does get repealed in New Mexico. What would happen if pretty soon after that repeal you have a large chunk of the state that is unlicensed, or a portion of the drivers in the state that are unlicensed? What kind of challenges does that present for law enforcement?
47 other states are dealing with that very issue, and they're dealing with it fairly well. I don't anticipate that it would be much of a challenge. You know, we have unlicensed drivers on the road now. Certainly, anytime you get more, there would probably be some challenge, but it goes back to people that are aspiring. If they're aspiring to be citizens, then I would suggest that they would want to honor the rules of the land. Driving is a privilege. That's the way that we feel about it. It's not a right. So I think those other 47 states that don't have licenses for undocumented individuals, they're dealing with it fine. As New Mexico with a smaller population, I don't think that it would be a huge challenge, or a challenge that local law enforcement could not overcome.
Okay, okay. And so Sarah, talk about What is your organization doing in terms of are you doing any lobbying efforts to support your cause? Or
Yeah, so we are collaborating with groups across the state to ensure that driver's licenses do maintain that our folks continue to have driver's licenses in New Mexico. We are working on where are the negotiating places? Where are the places that we are able to compromise? We've been fighting for the rights of New Mexicans across this country or across the state for over 5 years as CAFE, and I think our end goal is we agree. Like, we think that there could be tighter restrictions on driver's licenses. I think a lot of our community members are concerned if they change color or if there's a symbol that indicates that they're undocumented on the driver's license. But they're saying, I'll renew every year. I'll bring in 3 more different types of residency to prove my address. So they're willing to go that extra step because they don't want fraud happening either. And so there's places for us to compromise. Whether the legislative body and the governor will agree with those compromises is another story. We believe our analysis is that we'll have a repeat of last year. We'll set up a compromise bill, the governor won't support it, and we'll have the status quo again. And then we'll waste a bunch of time in Santa Fe instead of addressing things like education, our economy, and other important issues that are facing New Mexicans today. So I believe that it's a distraction to bigger issues that we need to be addressing as a state. And I think the other issue that I want to mention is the question that Captain Long addressed around, what are our folks preparing to do? Our leaders and people in our community aren't preparing for this law to be repealed because we know it won't. Our legislative body just isn't prepared to do something like that. However, we are preparing for immigration reform, and our folks are preparing to be citizens, and we're beginning to make a way for that at the state and national level.
What sorts of things are you preparing? How are they preparing for possible reform and a potential path to citizenship?
So just today we have a team of 6 people from New Mexico from 4 different religious denominations going up and talking to our congressional delegation about what would it take to make citizens of the 11 million that are currently here in our country. And how are we addressing the 40,000 students and young people that qualify for deferred action in New Mexico alone? There are things that we can be doing. So we have a team of 6 that are up there in DC. They just left today, and they're meeting with a team of 100 other people from 20 different states, including clergy and pastors, that are going to be talking and beginning to shape the debate around immigration reform.
Very good. And so, Captain Long, as a member of law enforcement out in the community, is there any kind of tension between law enforcement and the public, especially the immigrant community, because of this discussion with the driver's licenses?
It doesn't come up on our radar. Law enforcement, especially local law enforcement, we're understaffed. We are underfunded. We're busy. To add something else to our plate really that isn't going to affect our daily operations, our response to calls for service, 911 calls, traffic crashes, traffic enforcement. There's not a lot of dialogue going on as far as that. It's nothing that we're really preparing for.
But does it affect your relationship with the community? Are people at all in sort of the trust factor between the community and the police?
I hope not. The Doniana Sheriff's Office has really tried to reach out to the communities in the county to explain to the people that we're not concerned so much with their immigration status. What we're concerned about are criminals, criminal behavior, public safety, and quality of life for everybody that lives here, regardless of their status. We serve everybody here in Doniana County, and I would hope that that would those people in those communities would be open to that message from the department.
Okay, very good. And I guess, Sarah, we will end with you. If there is a message that you would like to send to the lawmakers that are just beginning their session now, what would that be?
I think there's a couple of things. I think one is nationally and locally, I believe that there's a way that we can solve this issue through immigration reform at the federal level. And there's a way that we can do it where we can continue to maintain the integrity of our borders and maintain the integrity of our neighborhoods in terms of weeding out those who are criminals or wanting to act bad in our communities, and those who are just wanting to get to work and school. That I think it's a both and, not an either or. And I really applaud the Sheriff's Department for taking those steps and wanting to build community and relationships. And I think that's going to go a long way. And I know that our communities deeply value law enforcement in terms of protecting and keeping their own neighborhood safe.
Very good. Well, I'd like to thank the two of you for coming on the show. Again, we have Captain Long from the Doña Ana Sheriff's Department and Sarah Nolan. She's the Director of New Mexico Communities in Action and Faith. This has been Fronteras, A Changing America.